At my sister's engagement party, I showed up with a thoughtful gift and a smile. Her fiancé barely glanced at it before declaring, "Oh, we were hoping for something useful." 10 days later, they showed up to tour their dream venue. Their names weren't on the guest list. Let me start from the beginning. I had always prided myself on being thoughtful when it came to gifts. Not the flashy, expensive kind that screamed for attention, but the meaningful ones that showed I actually listened and cared. So when my younger sister announced her engagement, I spent weeks thinking about what would be perfect for her and her fiancé. She'd always loved photography, even as a kid. Our family albums were filled with her amateur shots from disposable cameras, and in college, she'd taken every photography course available. When she moved in with him 2 years ago, she'd mentioned how she wanted to start a photo wall of their adventures together, but never seemed to find the time to organize all their digital photos. I found a local artisan who specialized in custom photo albums, the kind with hand-stitched leather binding and thick, archival quality pages. I had it personalized with their initials and the date they started dating, embossed in gold. Then I spent hours going through their social media, selecting their best photos from trips, date nights, and quiet moments, and had them professionally printed. The final touch was a handwritten note on the first page about how their love story deserved to be preserved in something beautiful. The engagement party was at their apartment, a cozy gathering of about 30 people. I arrived with the carefully wrapped album, genuinely excited to see their reaction. The party was in full swing when I found them near the gift table, surrounded by boxes of varying sizes. I approached them with a smile, extending the wrapped package. My sister's fiancé took it from my hands without really looking at me, his attention already drifting to someone else across the room. He gave it a cursory shake, as if trying to guess the contents by weight alone. When he finally unwrapped it, his face showed mild confusion rather than curiosity. He flipped through a few pages quickly, not really absorbing the carefully curated memories I'd spent so much time organizing. Then he looked up at me with what I can only describe as barely concealed disappointment. He told me they were hoping for something more useful, like something for their registry. His tone suggested I'd somehow failed a test I didn't know I was taking. My sister, standing beside him, didn't contradict him or offer any appreciation for the thought behind the gift. She just nodded along, as if agreeing that my weeks of careful planning and personal touches were somehow inadequate. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and something deeper, a hurt that went beyond the moment. I managed to mumble something about keeping the receipt and moved away from them as quickly as possible, spending the rest of the party nursing a beer in the corner and replaying the interaction in my mind. But as the days passed, that hurt transformed into something else entirely. I started thinking about the dynamic between my sister and her fiancé, how she'd changed since they'd been together. She used to be the kind of person who appreciated handmade gifts and personal touches. Now she seemed to have adopted his materialistic worldview, where gifts were measured by their price tags and practical utility rather than the thought behind them. I also started remembering other interactions with him over the past 2 years. The way he dismissed my career in social work as not really making money. How he'd roll his eyes when I talked about volunteering at the community center. The time he'd made a comment about my apartment being quaint, which everyone understood meant small and cheap. The man came from money, that much was obvious. His family owned several successful restaurants across the city, and he'd been handed a management position straight out of college. He drove a car worth more than I made in a year and wore watches that cost more than most people's rent. But more than his wealth, it was his attitude that grated on me. The assumption that financial success made him superior, that people like me were somehow lesser because we chose purpose over profit. Then came the perfect opportunity for what I initially told myself would just be a harmless prank. I was having lunch with my college roommate, who now worked in event planning for one of the city's most exclusive venues. She was telling me about her latest headache, a wealthy couple who'd booked their dream wedding venue for next spring, only to have their financing fall through at the last minute. The venue had a strict no-refund policy, and the couple had forfeited their substantial deposit. That's when she mentioned the venue's name, and my heart nearly stopped. It was the exact same place my sister had been gushing about for weeks. She'd shown me photos from their website, talked about how it was their absolute dream location, how they'd been trying to get a booking there for months. My friend continued explaining how the venue now had an opening for the exact date my sister wanted. and they were quietly reaching out to their preferred client list to see if anyone was interested. The booking included everything: the ceremony space, reception hall, catering, flowers, even a photographer. It was a package deal worth nearly $100,000. I felt something click in my mind. I asked my friend, hypothetically, what would happen if someone were to book that date and then, say, decide they didn't want certain people at their wedding? Could they control the guest list completely? She explained that whoever booked the venue had total control over everything: guest lists, vendors, timing, everything. The venue staff took their orders only from the person whose name was on the contract. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I liquidated my savings account, emptied my emergency fund, and took out a personal loan. The total came to just enough to secure the venue booking for my sister's dream date. I signed the contract using my own name, putting down the full deposit and first payment. My plan was simple. I would surprise them with the booking as a wedding gift, but I'd maintain control over the guest list. I'd exclude him and a few of his snobby friends who'd made similar comments about useful gifts over the years. Let them see what it felt like to be deemed not useful enough for their own wedding. But as I drove home that night, another idea began forming. Something more poetic than just excluding a few people from a wedding. 10 days after the engagement party, my sister called me, barely containing her excitement. She and her fiancé had managed to get a tour of their dream venue for the exact date they wanted. Someone had apparently had a last-minute cancellation, and the venue had reached out to couples on their waiting list. She was calling everyone to share the good news. They were going to tour the facility that afternoon, and if everything looked as perfect as they expected, they were prepared to put down a deposit immediately. I wished her luck and told her I hoped everything worked out exactly as she deserved. That afternoon, I made sure to be nearby when they arrived at the venue. I wanted to see their faces when reality hit. I watched from across the street as they pulled up in his expensive car, both of them practically glowing with anticipation. They walked into the venue hand in hand, probably already envisioning their perfect day. About 20 minutes later, they emerged. But instead of the joy I'd expected to see, both of their faces showed confusion and frustration. My sister was talking animatedly to her fiancé, gesturing with her hands in a way that suggested she was upset. He was on his phone, his jaw tense. I waited another hour before calling my sister, asking casually how the venue tour had gone. She told me it was the strangest thing. When they arrived and gave their names, the venue coordinator looked confused. After checking multiple times, she confirmed that not only were their names not on the guest list for that date, but the date was actually already booked. Someone else had reserved the entire venue just 3 days ago. My sister sounded genuinely bewildered. The venue had definitely called them about the availability. They'd confirmed the date and time. But somehow, in the short span between the phone call and their arrival, someone else had swooped in and claimed their dream wedding date. Her fiancé was apparently convinced it was some kind of mistake or miscommunication. He demanded to speak to managers, threatened to involve lawyers, made the kind of scene that rich people make when they can't buy their way out of a problem. But the venue coordinator had been firm. The booking was legitimate, the deposit had been paid in full, and there was nothing they could do. The date was taken. I made appropriate sympathetic noises and told my sister I was sure they'd find something even better. That evening, my sister called again. This time she was crying. She'd spent the entire day calling other venues, trying to find something comparable for their date. Everything else was either booked, way over their budget, or significantly below the standard they'd imagined for their wedding. The venue they'd toured wasn't just their dream location. It was realistically their only option for the kind of wedding they'd envisioned. Her fiancé was taking it even harder than she was. He was used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. The idea that someone else's money had spoken louder than his was clearly eating at him. I listened to my sister cry about how unfair it was, how they'd been so close to having everything perfect. Part of me felt guilty hearing her genuine distress. But then I remembered his dismissive comment about my gift, the way he'd made me feel small and thoughtless, and my resolve strengthened. Update 1. 3 weeks passed before my sister called with an update. They'd found another venue, not their dream location, but acceptable. The problem was that it was only available on a date 6 months later than they'd originally planned, pushing their wedding into the following year. The delay was causing cascading problems. Their honeymoon reservations would need to be canceled and rebooked at peak season rates. Several of their preferred vendors were no longer available. Worst of all, Her fiancé's grandmother, who'd been battling health issues, might not be well enough to travel by the new date. But what really struck me was how the situation was affecting their relationship. My sister mentioned that her fiancé had become obsessed with finding out who had booked their original venue. He'd been calling the venue repeatedly, trying to get information about the other couple. He'd even suggested hiring a private investigator to find out who had stolen their date. His behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and controlling. When my sister suggested maybe they should just be grateful they found somewhere else, he'd accused her of not caring enough about their wedding. When she'd mentioned that maybe the original venue was too expensive anyway, he'd gotten angry about her settling for less than they deserved. I realized I was seeing a side of him that my sister had probably been experiencing in private for months. The veneer of charm he showed in public was cracking, revealing someone who couldn't handle not getting his way. Meanwhile, I was sitting on a $100,000 venue booking with no wedding to host. Update 2. 2 months after the engagement party, my sister showed up at my apartment unexpectedly. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her shoulders I'd never seen before. She asked if we could talk, and I could tell this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. She told me that her fiancé's obsession with the venue situation had reached an unhealthy level. He'd actually hired someone to investigate the couple who had booked their dream date. What he discovered was that it wasn't a couple at all. It was a single person, someone local, who had apparently booked the entire venue for a private event. The investigator hadn't been able to get much more information than that, but it was enough to send her fiancé into a spiral of conspiracy theories. He was convinced someone was deliberately sabotaging their wedding. He'd started suspecting friends, family members, even business rivals of his family. But what really shook my sister was that he'd begun investigating our family specifically. He'd become convinced that someone close to her was behind it, since they'd somehow gotten access to inside information about the venue availability. She asked me directly if I knew anything about it. Looking at my sister, really looking at her, I saw someone who was stressed, exhausted, and beginning to question everything about her relationship. The man she'd fallen in love with was showing his true colors under pressure, and those colors weren't pretty. I made a decision that surprised even me. I told her everything. I explained about the gift, about how his comment had made me feel, about the opportunity with the venue, and about the booking I'd made in anger. I told her about watching them arrive that day, about the satisfaction I'd felt initially, and about the growing guilt I'd been carrying as I watched the situation spiral beyond what I'd intended. My sister listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something I couldn't quite read. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she asked me what I planned to do with the venue booking. I told her I honestly didn't know. The booking was in my name, paid for with my money, but it felt like I was holding something that belonged to her. At the same time, I couldn't just hand it over after everything that had happened. She nodded slowly, then asked if she could think about everything I told her. Update 3. A week later, my sister called and asked if I could meet her for coffee. She sounded different, calmer somehow, but also more decisive than she'd been in months. She told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking about our conversation and about her relationship. She'd realized that her fiancé's reaction to the venue situation had revealed things about his character that she'd been trying to ignore for months. The obsessive investigation, the conspiracy theories, the way he'd turned what should have been a minor setback into a major crisis. It all pointed to someone who couldn't handle not being in complete control. Someone who saw problems as things to be dominated rather than obstacles to work through together. She'd also been thinking about the gift situation, and she realized she owed me an apology. She'd let her fiancé's values override her own, dismissing something meaningful in favor of something practical. She'd forgotten who she used to be, someone who valued thought and creativity over price tags and utility. Then she asked me something I hadn't expected. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to transfer the venue booking to her name, but only if she was planning a different kind of wedding entirely. She was breaking up with her fiancé. The decision had been building for weeks, she said, but our conversation had crystallized things for her. She realized she didn't want to marry someone who brought out the worst in her, who made her value things she didn't actually care about, who turned her into someone she didn't recognize. She wanted to use the venue for a different kind of celebration, a party for family and close friends to celebrate her freedom and her return to being herself. She'd pay me back for the booking over time, but she wanted to turn my act of revenge into her act of liberation. I found myself smiling for the first time in months. My sister was back, the thoughtful, creative person I'd grown up with, not the materialistic stranger she'd become under his influence. We spent the next hour planning her freedom party, laughing about how perfect the venue would be for celebrating the end of a toxic relationship rather than the beginning of a doomed marriage. 6 months later, I stood in that beautiful venue watching my sister dance with our father, surrounded by people who loved her for exactly who she was. The custom photo album I'd made, the one her ex-fiancé had dismissed as not useful enough, sat on the gift table, filled with new photos of her rediscovering herself. As I watched her laugh with genuine joy for the first time in 2 years, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't about hurting someone who hurt you. Sometimes it's about helping someone you love remember their own worth. The venue was indeed perfect, just not for the wedding anyone had originally planned.